thanks, Ray. I'm going to be giving a very different kind of talk, and I also want to thank Tim and the rest of RIAC for having me at this wonderful event. I usually give a talk the same talk to a number of high schools and colleges in New York City about my own experience, my own military experience. And then I tend to speak to the politics of my experience or the politics of the broader foreign policy during the Q&A. So that's what I plan to do here as well. But the talk is designed to really get young people, to think seriously about the everyday experience of the frontline troops. So I always start off by emphasizing that this is my own story. This is my own perspective. A lot of the people I serve with obviously feel very differently about the politics surrounding our shared experience. Although you'd be surprised how much they agree with a lot of what I'm going to say tonight as well. So my story started off 2 weeks into college. I woke up around 7:45 in the morning. I went about my morning chores and I showed up at the student union. And there was an unusual amount of people there. There were about 200 people gathered around a large white screen, which had never been there before. And on the white screen was the face of Wolf Blitzer from CNN. And next to his face, there was a little box, and in the box you had one remaining World Trade Center towers that was still up. And within 2 minutes of me showing up, the second tower fell. And I remember everyone screaming, and I remember pulling out my cell phone at that point to call up my family back home. My grandparents lived in the city. I had other cousins that lived in the city, to make sure that everyone was all right. And that was really the first time in my life that I thought about joining the military. I didn't come from a military family. I didn't go to a military high school. I wasn't at a military college. I had nothing to do with ROTC. But this is the first time that I thought about donning the uniform and fighting for my country. I do have a grandfather that served during World War II in the Pacific. He fought at Iwo Jima. He got shot in the head. He has a metal plate in his head. And I've always looked up to him very much, but I never thought about following in his footsteps until 9/11. So to make a long story short, I started writing for the school newspaper. I started writing articles in support of both the war in Afghanistan and the eventual war in Iraq. I became the editorials editor at the school newspaper. I became the editor-in-chief of the political magazine on campus. So I became a prominent pro-war voice on campus, and it was around that time that I absolutely knew that I had to serve. I couldn't just be writing on behalf of these wars without actually putting my body on the line. So I graduated, and I ended up enlisting in the Marine Corps. I showed up at boot camp at Parris Island off the coast of South Carolina on June 6, 2006. And I remember that date specifically because it was 666, which was the day of the devil. And that's how we all us young, fresh, green recruits referred to it. And we thought it was this auspicious start for all of us, because Marines are called devil dogs. So we were all very excited. And the 2 points I always emphasize with the students is, one, boot camp is all about instilling a capacity to instantaneously obey orders. So a lot of that has to do with no longer being an individual. The easiest way to convince a big group of people to do whatever they're being told to do is to convince them that they're not individuals, that they're part of a larger organism, a larger unit. So right off the bat, you're not, and I'm sure many of you in this room know this, but I always emphasize this with young people that might not. You're no longer allowed to refer to yourself in the first person. So you don't say I, you say this recruit. So if you have to go to the bathroom, you say this recruit requests permission to go to the head sir. And that's just how you speak the entire way through. Everything is said in unison for the most part. There are times when you're able to speak as an individual with others, but a large part of the day you're always speaking in a call and response kind of way. So that's the kind of depersonalization element of entry-level training. And the other aspect is kind of a broader dehumanization. So you're kind of being dehumanized in a way, but you're also slowly being conditioned to dehumanize the populations that you're going to be effectively killing once you get deployed. So I have time to give a number of examples, but I don't have a lot of time right now, so I'll just leave you with one example of this kind of dehumanization process. And by the way, just to speak a little bit, when I speak of dehumanization, there's a book that came out a number of years ago by a lieutenant colonel in the Army called On Killing, which is all about the conditioning process in entry-level training. And basically, during World War II, there were a number of studies done after the war by our own government, and they concluded that the majority of frontline soldiers were actually not firing directly at the enemy. They were firing above, they were firing to the left, they were firing to the right. So the military thought this was incredibly inefficient. I mean, it was inefficient as far as the amount of rounds that were being wasted. It was also just an inefficient way to fight and win any particular battle. So they put a lot of time and effort into making sure that by the time soldiers made it to the front lines, they were willing to pull the trigger and aim in on the enemy that first shot. And that's how we came up with the phrase "one shot, one kill," which is something you hear all the time in the Marine Corps. So by the time the Vietnam War rolled around, frontline soldiers were in fact firing at the enemy by the first shot. And by the time I showed up in 2006, this process had been even more honed. So I remember we spent days learning bayonet training, and there hasn't been a real significant bayonet charge in any of our wars since the Korean War. So you have to ask yourself, and I asked myself at the time, like, why we're spending so much time on this bayonet training? Well, what we were doing is we had these body bags, either body bags, actually it was mostly rubber tires, and but it would shaped to look like a human being, and you'd spend hours just in unison stabbing these rubber tires, and it would be in unison, and we would all say the same thing. We would say, kill, kill, kill Haji, kill, kill, kill Haji, kill, kill, kill Haji. So the word Haji, for those of you who might not be familiar, it's a term of respect amongst Muslims. The root is Hajj, which is the pilgrimage to the holy city of Mecca. So a Haji is one who makes the pilgrimage to the holy city of Mecca. So we inverted this term of respect, and it became a derogatory term, much like gook or Jap or the N-word. And that's a word that carried over well beyond boot camp. I mean, that was more or less what we called the people we were fighting once we were in Afghanistan. We called them either Haji or Talib, which meant member of the Taliban, which was the government that we overturned. Brutal government, but by the time we showed up, we weren't even really fighting just members of the Taliban. We were fighting a number of different groups, but we either referred to them as Talib or Haji. So I could give other examples of this, but I think that speaks to the kind of dehumanization process that I'm talking about. So I'm going to fast forward a little bit. I ended up, I had the opportunity because I had already gone to college to become an officer, and I ended up becoming a signals intelligence officer. So I'm sure many of you have heard of the NSA, the National Security Agency. I was actually trained there for a number of months. Once I got to Afghanistan, it was kind of a two-part. We had two missions. Well, first of all, we had two bosses. I worked for both my unit. We worked for both the NSA, and we also worked for the Marine Corps. We were Marines, but we had two chains of command. And then there were kind of two joint missions that my unit was involved in. One was going after kind of more high-level commanders, and that involved going after higher forms of technology, so computers, cell phones, satellite phones, stuff like that. And developing real, what we called kill packages, where you would follow around these individuals, you would find out their daily routine, find out who they're associated with, we'd create charts of their associations, then we'd create kill packages or target packages with their associates, and this would go on forever. We were always hunting for new targets. So that was one element of the process, and I was there for a year, and for the latter half, the final 6 months, I did a lot of that kind of work. But the first 6 months, I dealt with the first part of our mission, which is more kind of immediate intel provision. it's called providing indications and warnings. So I had a number of Marines spread out across an area of operations the size of my home state of Connecticut. So it was a pretty large AO, and I had about 12 teams spread, and each team had about 2 to 8 men. It was an all-male unit, and they were attached to frontline units. So they were attached to infantry units, reconnaissance units, and occasionally special forces units. And they would go out on these missions with the frontline units, and they would provide real-time intelligence. They would be able to, with the kind of gear that they had and the kind of training that they had, they'd be able to tell the frontline units if there was an enemy in the area, how many of them there were, what weapons they had, what their intent was, if there were any improvised explosive devices. This is the kind of intel that they were collecting and providing during the mission. So the first half of my time there, it was my job to kind of travel from one team to another and supervise my Marines to make sure that they were doing the job that they were supposed to be doing. So I would actually go out on these missions with my guys. So it was really during the first 6 months that I experienced what a lot of the people in this room would think of as war. That's when I experienced explosions, occasional gunfights. Relative to my Marines, I experienced minimal combat, but I did experience combat. They were going out every day. I went out, on major missions, I went out on probably a half dozen for that entire 6 months. I went out on more minor missions as well. But so I want to leave you with just one story that I think symbolizes or embodies my experience in Afghanistan and why I ended up really making my own about face, why I ended up reversing on a lot of my own initial beliefs about not only the war in Afghanistan, but about American foreign policy in general. So I'd been on a very long convoy. It lasted about 2 days from one base to another, and it was because there were a lot of IEDs, improvised explosive devices, kind of makeshift bombs that were in our route. So there were, I don't remember exactly, but I think we got hit like 3 or 4 times. So there were 3 or 4 different vehicles that landed on an IED and exploded, and then we had to wait for the medevac to show up, and so it lasted about 2 days. There was also a sandstorm. So the point is, I was very exhausted by the time I showed up at this small base. It was about 30 Marines. It was a pretty small outpost, and most of the Marines that I had been working with at this point were Marines that I had helped train in California before we got deployed. But this was actually a team that had moved in from another area of operations, so I didn't train these guys, so I didn't know them. So I showed up pretty late that night, and I was exhausted, and really my priority was just to get to know these guys a little bit before we went to bed, just to kind of gain their trust and get an idea of who they were, and they can get an idea of who I was. So we basically just talked about our favorite TV shows, our favorite movies, our favorite books, what we wanted to do with our lives, stuff like that. And then I figured the next morning I could get the real intel brief on the area, what had been going on in the past 2 days, since the last time I was at a computer. We got woken up the next morning. There was a stray fire that was being fired above and around the outpost. And I had experienced this a lot at this point. We all had. So it was at this point, it was kind of routine. It was normal. It was expected. But we went out of our little intel hut, and there were a few Marines congregating on the corner, and you had about 2 to 3 Marines that were in the prone, so they were on the ground already, and they were firing back into the corner of this village where the suspected fire had been coming from, and this is called harassing fire. Again, it was very routine my entire time in Afghanistan. Basically, in the morning, they would fire at us. Sometimes we'd be fired. We would initiate. It was a language we spoke to each other. It was kind of like they would say good morning, and then we would say good morning, just to let each other know that we had our eyes on each other, and we planned to, let them know that we might have an intent to approach them at some point. So I figured this would die out in a matter of a few minutes, but at this point, we were just getting very basic radio traffic. We were listening on the radio traffic in the area, and the intel we got was that there were about 3 guys on radios in this part of the village that the Marines were already firing back at, and that, again, it was just harassing fire. There was no broader intent on their part, and they were probably going to head out soon anyway. So I figured that, again, this would subside pretty soon. But I watched as the Marines went from the M16, M4 rifles, which is the standard issue rifle, and they moved up to the SAW, which is a small arm machine gun, which I had seen before too, so I didn't think much of it. But a few minutes later, they moved up to the 240 Golf, which is a medium-sized machine gun. And at this point, I'm starting to wonder what's going on, because we weren't getting any incoming fire at this point. My Marines weren't providing any new intel at this point. So I figured that there must be intel coming from somewhere else, or maybe there's something about the situation on the ground that I don't know about. This is what I'm telling myself, and I'm just kind of watching this as it's happening. And then the Marines moved up to what's called a Mark 19, which is it's a large machine gun, and it's large because every single round that comes out of it is a grenade. So it's both a grenade launcher and a machine gun. So it fires at the rapid rate. It fires just like a machine gun. So you're talking about a major impact in the distance. So it was at this point where you started seeing smoke in the distance in the corner of this village and a little fire. And again, at this point, we hadn't had incoming fire for about 15 to 20 minutes. And it was also around this time that Marines started taking out their phones. And I have to be honest about this. I also took out my phone, and they weren't taking out their phone to call anyone. There wasn't any reception in the area. All the phone towers have been either destroyed or dismantled at this point. We were all taking out our phones to take pictures or to videotape the action, which is something that I saw a lot of my time when I was out there. It's something I experienced, I took part in as well. You can go on YouTube and you could YouTube and just put in the words Afghanistan firefight or Iraq firefight, Syria firefight, Marines, or United States Army, and you'll come up with hundreds of these videos, because it's quite common. A lot of firefights, even intense ones, Marines and other frontline units someone would take out their phone and videotape it or take pictures. I actually brought pictures, which I'll pass out in a little bit, of the pictures that I took during this event. So everyone's taking out their phone, and again, I'm just telling myself, there must be something I don't know. I showed up late last night. I haven't gotten the intel brief yet. Maybe we have some Marines in the area, an adjacent unit that we're protecting. So I'm just watching at this point. And then they go from the Mark 19 to what's called an AT-4, which is an anti-tank rocket. It's designed to disable tanks, and it's a one-use disposable weapon. So you put it on your shoulder, you hit a red button, a rocket comes out, and then you can never use that weapon again. I watched as a Marine put this on his shoulder, fired a rocket into the distance, and a pretty big explosion, and at this point, the whole corner of the village was just up in flames. And then I'm starting to kind of listen in to what the Marines are talking about, because I am very kind of urgently curious about what the situation actually is. And I can hear Marines saying like, hey, this is awesome. We're finally going to get to see this weapon or that weapon. So I'm starting to get an idea of what the context is. So this was a group of Marines that had been in country for about over 5 months. They were headed home in a few weeks, and they had lost friends of theirs since they had been out there. Other friends had been severely injured, and it was clear from the discussion that they felt like this entire village was hostile, that every single one of them was the enemy. So they felt like this was a proportionate response, not just to the stray fire we got that morning, but to the larger story that had preceded this moment. And then the other aspect was that they were about to go home, and there were some weapons that some of these Marines had been trained on that they didn't get to use. And they were very honest, and I remember these conversations distinctly, that they wanted to use some of these weapons before they went back to the States. So again, we're all still videotaping, and after the AT-4, I see 2 Marines setting up what's called a javelin. It's a 2-part weapon. It's actually a missile. It's a shoulder-fired missile. So whereas a rocket is It's undirected. It basically just goes in the general direction of where you point it. A missile is more kind of mathematically directed. It's a computer system. It's more targeted, more calculating. So I watched as one Marine was on his knee, he had this giant machine on his shoulder, and then there was another Marine who was the spotter that was next to him with a binocular looking thing, but a very massive looking binocular thing, kind of aiming in on, and again, I don't know where they were getting the intel to know exactly where to aim or anything, but I watched as they fired a javelin out into the distance, and that was an even bigger explosion. And then the finale, and I use that word deliberately because I think that really does capture the mentality of all of us at this time. For us, this was a form of entertainment. I mean, it was also a form of revenge. It was a form of a lot of things, but there was definitely a way in which we were all being entertained by this. We had our phones up.
For a second.
Yes.
Where was the leadership? Where was
Yeah.
the lieutenant? Where was the lieutenant colonel? Why wasn't there someone to stop this?
There's going to be a question and answer.
Well, that's fine, but I'm
maybe you can ask
pretty
that
angry
now.
about this whole thing.
Yeah, no, I think you should be angry.
Yeah.
So the captain, who was the company commander,
Right.
was not on the base at the time. He showed up later. The senior infantry person on the base was a gunnery sergeant.
Okay.
He was the one directing all of this.
Mhm.
I was the senior officer, but I had shown up the night before. And I mean, there's not a moment that goes by where I don't regret not trying to stop this.
Right.
But again, at the time I was convincing myself, I was telling myself that I had just shown up. I was an outsider. I mean, the infantry tends not to look too kindly on an intelligence officer who just shows up on their base, telling them, barking orders at them. So I wish I had tried to intervene in some way. I don't know what would have happened if I did that. I wouldn't be surprised if the gunnery sergeant told me to fuck off, and the captain, just assuming the captain would have had his back, which I think probably would have been the case. But when the captain did show up, I did talk to him. I mean, I forget, it happened years ago, so I don't remember the exact conversation, but I talked to him about this event, and I tried to get information about what the context was, and he just almost kind of was ignoring what I was saying. Like, I just remember him kind of just brushing it off, like, oh yeah, it's a tough area. Like, that was the kind of response. And I remember I ended up going back, and I was going to speak about this later on, but I ended up going back to my big base that I was stationed at, the regimental level base, and talking to my own captain, one of my own bosses, about this.
It sounds very much like My Lai.
Yes. So My Lai, for those of you, I'm sure most people are familiar with My Lai, but My Lai was one of many massacres in Vietnam. I mean, there's a wonderful book, Kill Everything That Moves, by Nick Turse, which documents hundreds of these type incidents. And I hope if there's one point that I want to drive home is that things like My Lai weren't unique to the Vietnam War. That stuff is still very much happening. It's a different war in a lot of ways. But if you put a bunch of young men into a desert and you train them to kill, and then some of their friends get killed, they're not gonna just kill the bad guys, so to speak. They're gonna kill a lot of what's in the area, and this is also part of my story. But after this happened, everyone puts their phones away and everyone goes about their daily routine. I ended up going back in the intel hut with my Marines, and we had about a 2-hour discussion about what had just happened. It was really a debate, and because I'm still trying, I'm like, hey guys, so what's going on here? Did we have Marines in the area? And they were like, no sir, like this whole village. Two of the guys that was part of this team were very open that they thought this entire village was hostile, that they were all Taliban, and they were justifying this action simply on those grounds, that the entire village was the enemy and that we were firing back at the enemy. The other Marines were more where I was at that point, where they thought that the intel that we were providing was not commensurate to the action that we were seeing unfold before us. So I think I'm going to leave it at that. I mean, I usually tell the story a little differently, but you kind of, your question forced me to get to the kind of the final part of the story. I mean, the next morning we got a knock on the door at 4 in the morning, and they wanted to use one of my Marines, because some of my Marines, in order to listen to the radio traffic, they needed to be able to understand Pashto, which is the language of the people in the Helmand province, and they wanted to use one of my Marines as a linguist translator, because one of the locals showed up in a beat-up car with his wife in the vehicle. She was, and I don't remember if she was actually dead, but she was certainly severely injured. She might have been dead, but he was distraught and was screaming at the front of the base, and I remember watching at a distance as my Marine was doing the translating. The civil affairs Marine, so it was another Marine on the base who was his job. He was given a wad of cash, basically a few hundred, if not maybe at most a few $1,000s. And it was his job whenever locals came to the base after incidents like this to basically just give them money, throw a little money at them. They called them reparations. NPR has a very important interview with a reporter who wrote a story on these reparations that were given out and are still being given out on the front lines in Afghanistan and Iraq and Syria. Wherever this happens, there's always a Marine with some money to basically throw at the locals until they go away. So I remember watching that as well. And yeah, I mean, I talked about this at the time with a lot of people. I talked about it with fellow lieutenants. I talked about it with the captain who ended up showing up in the next day or two. I talked about it with one of my own supervisors once I made it back to the regimental base. And the attitude was just unanimously one of indifference. That this is what war is, Rubin. You know, this is how they talk to me about it. They're like, hey, stop whining. You know, that was the general response.